Hello and welcome to The Week Ahead. I'm Christopher Lockwood, and later on today's show, has Turkey made itself a soft target for terror attacks?
He's been playing a very tricky double game. They're next door to Syria because his top priority has been to prevent the Syrian Kurds from declaring an independent state there that might encourage Kurdish separatism within Turkey.
First, though, we're in the UK, where a week after Britain's made the shock decision to leave the European Union, the country's political parties are in turmoil.
I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
David Cameron, Britain's Prime Minister, has promised to resign by September and hand over responsibility for negotiating Brexit to his successor, whoever that may be. The opposition Labour Party's leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has fared no better, losing most of his shadow cabinet to resignations in recent days and facing an overwhelming vote of no confidence from his MPs. As of now, he says he won't step down, but he may very soon face a leadership challenge. I'm joined now by Tom Wainwright, our Britain editor, and Anton La Guardia, our deputy foreign editor. Tom, to an outside observer, it looks as though all parts of Britain's parliament are tearing themselves apart. Wasn't there a plan for how the government would deal with the Leave result?
Well, it seems not. It seems at the moment as if the one person who did have a plan was Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, who immediately swung into action following the result. But by contrast, the leaders of the main parties in Westminster didn't seem to know what they were doing. The backers of the Leave campaign, which won, obviously, seemed themselves to be rather surprised that they had won, and we didn't really hear much from them for days. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, didn't say anything for a couple of days. David Cameron didn't say much after his resignation. And really, since the Brexit vote, things have been incredibly choppy. It's very, very hard to predict what's going to happen next, other than that we're in for a lot of uncertainty.
Well, let's start at the beginning. First of all, we know that David Cameron has gone. We know, therefore, that a new Tory leader is in the process of being chosen. Nominations have now closed, and the main candidates are, very surprisingly, Michael Gove, who said he wouldn't run, Boris Johnson, who said he would run, isn't a candidate. Theresa May is also a candidate, the Home Secretary. There are a couple of other much less likely candidates. What do you think is likely to happen? How do you see this battle now unfolding?
Well, it's very hard to say, but I think the surprise withdrawal of Boris Johnson from the race has changed things rather a lot. Nobody was expecting Michael Gove to enter, and as soon as he threw his hat into the ring on Thursday morning, it immediately became clear that Boris Johnson was going to find it much harder. Only the top two candidates, as chosen by MPs, get through to the final runoff, at which point Tory party members are the ones who make the final decision. And Boris Johnson clearly felt that his chances of making the final top two were greatly diminished. My best guess at the moment, and these things seem to be changing hour by hour, but at the moment it seems that the most likely frontrunners who are likely to make it through to the final round are Theresa May and Michael Gove. From that point on, everything is uncertain.
Yes, I agree. It does seem not just likely, almost inevitable, really. It's very hard to see any of the others. Stephen Crabb is one, somebody, I'm afraid, who hardly anyone has ever heard of, despite his good qualities. And Andrea Leadsom. Seems hard to see them making it to the next two. What differences do you see between the two people that are most likely to be those top two, the ones that are put to the party membership of about 150,000 for a final decision?
Well, the big decision at the moment, the big question in Britain, obviously, is its relationship with Europe. And I think that's the area where voters and Tory party members are going to quiz those two candidates most closely. And they're a funny pair because Michael Gove, of course, was on the Leave campaign and campaigned very strongly for Leave throughout. Theresa May was actually on the Remain campaign, but she had a rather quiet referendum. She deliberately, it seems, very much took a back seat. And people think that actually privately she's rather Eurosceptic and that her decision to back Remain may have been because she thought that was the side that was going to win. It seems, though, that if anything, it may have positioned her quite well because Tory party members now, Tory supporters who voted Remain, the relatively few that did, may see her as their favoured candidate. Meanwhile, those who are Eurosceptic can agree with her on most of what she says about immigration, for instance, on which she's always trod a fairly hard line. Michael Gove is probably the more sort of intellectually committed of the two to Brexit. He, if anything, one would expect, would be more likely to negotiate a sort of harder version of Brexit. He said during the referendum campaign that he could cope with the thought of life outside the single market, which is probably the single most important question now. If Britain does leave the European Union, will it have an arrangement rather like that of Norway, in which it still retains access to the market, or will it be properly out in the cold on its own, with perhaps the prospect of negotiating some kind of free trade agreement? So it seems as though really the big choice now is between Gove, the hard Brexiteer, if you like, and Theresa May, who might be the slightly softer of the two. But either way, it looks as if Britain is increasingly likely to have a proper Brexit, and that the slim chance of an escape route is looking ever slimmer.
An escape route, for instance, being something like a second referendum. You negotiate for a bit, you see what you end up with, and then you put it to the people. Theresa May has ruled that out in explicit terms. I'm not sure what Michael Gove has done, but I imagine he's done, or certainly would do, much the same thing. So do you actually think there is any chance now of this vote being overturned?
I wouldn't rule anything out at this stage because things are changing so quickly.
Yes, ask us in 10 minutes.
Both in Britain and in Europe, things are changing. Theresa May, as you say, she said that there's not going to be a second referendum. There could still be a general election, though. There seems to be a feeling that the Brexit that people voted for was so ill-defined that really whatever deal the British negotiators come up with in Brussels may have to be put to the people for a second time. It could be that the negotiators come back with something looking rather Norwegian, or it could be that they come back with something looking, much more radical. And many people who voted for Leave thought that they were going to get the best of both worlds. They were going to have no immigration and full access to the market. The one thing we do know is that is impossible, or it seems highly, highly unlikely.
So it really now is a choice of what sort of model, Norwegian, Swiss, WTO, whatever, we can get. And of course, Britain's negotiating cards aren't that strong. They were much stronger before we had this vote. Anton, you know Europe very well. What do you think the Europeans are likely to offer us?
I think that the idea that Britain could have full access to the single market, crucially for financial services in the City of London, and also have some kind of let-out from the free movement of people is not going to happen. The Europeans denied it to David Cameron when he tried to negotiate his deal. They said no. Now that Britain has voted to leave, they're unlikely to say yes. So the question, I think, for the new Prime Minister will be, which promise does he break, or does she break? Is it the promise to sort of maintain a sort of prosperous trading relationship with Europe, which essentially means remaining in the single market, or is it that they want to restrain migration from the European Union, which, by the way, is only half of the migration problem. There is a common perception there's too much migration across Europe, but the unhappiness is different in different countries. For Britain, the issue has been European workers coming here to look for jobs and then using public services. In the rest of Europe, it's mostly about non-European migrants and refugees. And that's really a question about Schengen. So I would see the Europeans more likely to make a concession on Schengen than they would on the freedom of Europeans to work across the EU.
That's interesting. But the principle of freedom of movement isn't completely sacrosanct, is it? For instance, we've had long derogation periods in the case of Bulgaria and Romania. I realise it's not quite the same thing, but it's a step away from the purity of the ideal.
Yes, indeed. And it is the free movement of workers rather than free movement of everybody and anybody. Nevertheless, I think that it is unlikely that they have said there's no change. There will be no change on this. They have also said there will be no negotiation until Britain triggers the formal procedure to leave, which sets Britain at a disadvantage in terms of negotiation.
No formal negotiation, but I have no doubt at all that there will be back-channel stuff, not at an EU level, but on a bilateral basis. They can't stop people doing that.
It would be very odd for them not to talk to Britain, given that it still, as of today, remains a full member of the European Union with full access to the Commission and everybody else.
A lot of that will depend on how much the rest of the EU wants Britain to stay, or wants Britain to be in a very close relationship with Europe. Do they?
I think everybody was shocked by the result, and a lot of countries would dearly have liked this not to happen. So they either hope it won't happen in the end, that there'll be a fudge, or that Britain can somehow be enticed back. The people who are very excited about this are, of course, all the Eurosceptic parties who have been on the rise across Europe. Marine Le Pen had a poster of Brexit with chains being broken saying France is next. In at least half a dozen other countries, there are Eurosceptic parties asking for referendums identical or similar to the one that Britain has just had. In the Netherlands, the Party of Freedom is top of the polls. In France, Marine Le Pen looks likely to get into the second round of a French presidential election.
And then and probably lose.
Possibly, but, people thought Brexit would lose and it won. So once you're in an electoral cycle, you don't quite know how things are going to happen. In Italy, there are at least two fairly Eurosceptic parties. So the road ahead is filled with dangers for the European Union. And as well as negotiating the divorce settlement with Britain, they will have to be thinking about what do they do about their own internal situation, how do they reform the EU. There are lots of ideas around. It is the classic thing that European federalists think that every crisis is a moment for more Europe. But at this moment, most voters seem to be saying we want less Europe.
Now, of course, that brings us a little bit back to the Brexiteers. The Brexiteers used as one of their big arguments, this is a failing institution. The EU will not survive. Chances of that?
I think the chances of the EU in some way collapsing have plainly increased. Skepticism of the EU is rising. However, they have a tendency to kind of find a fudge at the last minute. When they look down the chasm, they often come up with a last-minute tweak to the system, but it's extremely hard to get any progress. And it's also extremely hard to undo things that have been decided because of high majorities and vetoes across the system.
Well, certainly, judging by the summit that they had in Brussels this week, there didn't seem to be an enormous appetite for relitigating any of this in order to keep Britain in. So I don't hold out a lot of hope. Tom Wainwright, Anton La Guardia, thank you. Well, what do you think? If you have anything to add or want to tell us about the events shaping the week ahead in your country, you can tweet us at Economist Radio or contact us via email at radio@economist.com. Next, we turn to Turkey, where more than 40 people were killed on June the 28th in a terrorist attack at Istanbul's Ataturk airport. This is just one of a string of attacks in Turkey, in fact, one of 9 attacks in the last 9 months. With me now is our foreign editor, Robert Guest. Robert, what makes Turkey particularly vulnerable to such attacks? Why are they happening so frequently?
Well, Turkey has made itself tragically vulnerable to this, or rather, Turkey's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he's been playing a very tricky double game. They're next door to Syria because his top priority has been to prevent the Syrian Kurds from declaring an independent state there that might encourage Kurdish separatism within Turkey. He's, since 2011, allowed a stream of jihadists to use Turkey as a stepping-off base in order to go into Syria and fight against the regime of Bashar Assad, whom Erdogan hates. This is not official policy, of course, but they have known that many of these people going to fight in Syria through Turkey have been jihadists, and they've let it happen. And now you've got a large terrorist network within Turkey that's striking against its host.
And these are Turkish people or people that have come from other parts of the Muslim or indeed European world through Turkey and into Syria, as far as we know?
It's both sorts, Turkish and foreign. And because belatedly he's been cracking down within Turkey on terrorist suspects there and also allowing coalition aircraft to use Turkish airfields to strike against IS in Syria, he's enraged Islamic State. Now, we assume that the bombing at the airport was done by Islamic State. They haven't claimed responsibility for it. They don't tend to claim responsibility for hitting targets within Turkey. But we know that all their social media presence, all the chatter on social media has been accusing Turkey of being part of the Crusader alliance. That's why we assume it was them, and the Turkish government thinks so too. Turning
to another aspect of Turkish politics at the moment, we're seeing some signs of pragmatism from this very prickly Mr. Erdogan. They've just now normalised relations with Israel, which were on hiatus for 6 whole years.
Yes. Now, that's a very encouraging sign. It's not easy to reverse yourself and make peace with a country that's, after all, very unpopular within the Middle East. But it's certainly the sensible, pragmatic thing for Turkey to do. It can't afford to be picking fights with everyone. And there are some who say that maybe that was what caused the terrorist attack on the airport, which happened very shortly afterwards. I think that's very unlikely. Terrorist plots of this complexity take time to put together. So we got to assume that this was pre-planned before that news came out.
And from the point of view of Israel, will this pay some dividends? What do they hope to get out of it?
Israel would really like to get on well with its neighbours in the region, and there are a large number who are just implacably hostile. Having Turkey less hostile, having it as a frenemy, if you like, is much better than having it as an enemy.
And of course, another part of it is the undertaking that they've had from the Turks now that they will, while not closing down Hamas's office, keep a very close eye on it. Hamas is the Islamic government that rules in the Gaza Strip, and they are very closely allied to Mr. Erdogan's Justice and Development Party. I mean, doctrinally, very, very similar parties. And severing or weakening the link between the two will be a big benefit for Israel. And, of course, another thing that we might see is more pragmatism concerning how Mr. Erdogan deals with the Kurds, his own internal Kurds, who've caused him so much difficulty up till now. Are there any prospects for that?
It's very hard to say. He has previously calculated that playing up the Kurdish threat and being divisive and stoking the fight has been good for him electorally. But I think there's a limit to that. I mean, you see the extraordinary damage that instability in Turkey has done to the tourism industry and the economy as a whole. And a lot of Turks are feeling, we don't actually want to be fighting. So there's at least a very good case to make that he should be showing more pragmatism in dealing with the Kurds.
Well, thanks very much, Robert. That's all for this week. To read our leaders on Brexit and the attack in Turkey, pick up the latest issue of The Economist or visit our website at economist.com. Do join us again next time as we look at the events shaping the week ahead. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.